Alright YouTube, it's time for another video on Fukushima, because there has been more news. I actually tried to make this video last night, and I couldn't get it. For some reason, the audio just kept fucking up over and over again, and I've told people this. My internal webcam tries to take control for audio, and the internal webcam sucks for audio, so anytime that happens, I end up having to remake the video. Anytime the audio quality is low, it's because my internal webcam decided to turn on without my permission. So I've tried everything I can to disable it, and for some reason it won't go away. So, I have to remake the videos. But Fukushima, right now, is falling apart. I think TEPCO at this point realizes that they can't really solve the problems at this site. If you look, for instance, at Chernobyl, you had a smaller meltdown. You had one reactor meltdown at Chernobyl, 3 at Fukushima. You didn't have fuel pools all over the place. It wasn't in an earthquake and tsunami-prone area. And Chernobyl still isn't solved to this day. They marched hundreds of thousands of people in there to bury the entire site. And Chernobyl persists in being too radioactive for people to stick around very long. They're in the planning stages of building a second containment unit because the first one is degrading. And that's Chernobyl, where less radioactivity was released, where a smaller area was contaminated, let's face it. And TEPCO can deny this up and down, but we know that that's the case. But the latest news, and link in the description for that, is that the groundwater at one of these test wells at the Fukushima site, I believe it was Unit 3, although it was Unit 1, where there was a leak recently because some workers thought one of the storage tanks was empty, so they disconnected it to hook it up to pump water into it. It was actually full. 300 tons of highly radioactive untreated water came gushing out. One person wasn't wearing boots at the time for some inexplicable reason and got their feet all soaked with radioactive water. They had to get treatment for this problem. Apparently that highly radioactive water has already, and that's, by the way, a very quick time frame for it to do so, has already hit the groundwater, because radiation spiked 6,500 times higher in the test well closest to this spill site. This should tell us several things. Number one, the workers at TEPCO are undertrained and in dire straits right now. And there was another story that the morale around this site has dropped considerably because it's dragged on so long. And a lot of these people are so new because, remember, people reach their annual limit of exposure at some places on this site within weeks. So they've been training relatively new people that don't have much experience, if any at all. And these people are apparently showing up to work drunk. They're showing up to work hungover and having heat stroke because they're dehydrated. They're using drugs, some of these people are. And no disrespect to the workers. I mean, if you were divorced from your family by tens of miles or hundreds of miles because they had to leave the exclusion zone, because remember, a lot of these workers, they lived within the exclusion zone. Their families had to evacuate further away. They can't evacuate, though. They've still got to remain on site to work. So these people, they don't see their families. They're working double shifts in some cases. They're in constantly dangerous positions, and there are continuous errors at this site. Their morale is low enough now so that a lot of these people have taken up drinking. They're binge drinking because what else is there to fucking do? The largest city in the area was evacuated. Now you've just got a few small towns. There's probably not much to do other than drink at these locations. Their food is probably tainted with radioactivity. There's not much hope at this site. So first and foremost, the workers' morale is lower. So that just contributes to more errors. Number two, this should tell us that at the Fukushima site, the water, the ground has become so swollen with water that radioactivity, instead of simply slowly seeping through, is simply gushing down through the water towards the groundwater level. Because this level of a spike in radioactivity would be unheralded if this fluid hadn't simply gone straight to groundwater. This is a major jump in the amount of radioactivity at this test well. And remember, This November, not long from now, a few weeks from now, they're going to begin the process of attempting to extract damaged fuel assemblies from Unit 4's storage pond, from a storage tank inside the building. It's like 7 stories up off the ground. They're going to try to do this. This building is already leaning to one side, so they had to shore it up for one thing. These fuel assemblies are presumably damaged, presumably corroded because it's full of seawater. The zinc cladding between assemblies is probably heavily degraded, if it's even still there at all. So you've got this situation where they're going to try to extract these fuel assemblies using manual cranes because they can't use automated systems because they simply can't weigh down the structure that much or they might suffer collapse. They're going to attempt to remove them. As some people have said, well, these assemblies are too old and inert to go critical, to essentially have a meltdown. Actually, there was a report some weeks ago that before the tsunami even hit, when something else went wrong at this site, something more routine, it didn't cause major problems, but something happened at the site, and they started putting more fresh fuel into this particular pool. If that's true, and one of these rods, while being lifted out of the pool, breaks, and particles start showering down back into the pool or something, you could have a criticality. The likelihood isn't high, but it is theoretically there. The other possibility is one of these rods breaks, and a piece flies off into the building, and it becomes too radioactive for people to even go back in to remove the rest of the assemblies. The problem is, any more problems at this particular site would make the entire building, because it is vented, but it's an enclosed area, it would make it too radioactive to work in. You could have a very serious problem. The other problem is this site is still right on the ocean, prone to tsunamis and storms and things like that. The ground is still unstable. And you could theoretically still have another 8.0 plus earthquake at this site, either on land, which means things get shaken loose, or out somewhat at sea, which means you have another massive tsunami hit this site and damage it further. If that were to happen right now, these generation systems are essentially on the backs of trucks. They'd get washed away. They'd be useless. Pipes would break. Buildings would potentially collapse, and then all of this water would go down into the already soaked soil and wash all of the radioactivity from the corium back out to sea. You'd have an enormous release of radioactivity. This site is still unstable. What's not clear is if they are capable of solving these issues. It's not entirely clear that there is any way to solve them. Because again, as we saw at Chernobyl, when a presumably smaller disaster happened, although people will lie and say Fukushima is a smaller disaster, knowing nothing about how much was released, you've still got problems at Chernobyl. There's still an exclusion zone. There's still radioactivity all around that exclusion zone. There's still very high radioactivity around the enclosure, which encloses the failed reactor. There are still birth defects. There are still cases of thyroid cancer. I looked at one chart from Belarus, Belarus, I think it's pronounced, which is not local to the Chernobyl area. The life expectancy dropped by something like 20 years shortly after Chernobyl melted down, because this area, for some reason, because of the wind patterns, got a huge dose of fallout. Literally, like 15, 20 years less life expectancy. Cancer skyrocketed, birth defects, stillborn children, all sorts of problems just skyrocketed in Belarus after this happened. And only in the last few years has the trend very slowly begun to reverse. Now, you can't blame it on, their medicine just failed or anything like that. No, it was an ongoing problem. There was nothing else to account for this sudden loss of life and health. It was simply the result of people were eating highly tainted food. They didn't have systems in place to decontaminate. People were living and breathing this nuclear material. Think about people who still live within a reasonable distance of Fukushima. They're getting the same level of radioactivity. Japan has one of the highest is one of the healthiest countries. It has one of the highest life expectancies, low infant mortality, generally a healthy culture, both because of diet and exercise, and simply because of maybe the genetic makeup of the island, and simply the climate. We're not exactly sure why, but they have a good health system as well. I would say that the life expectancy of Japan is going to tank. It's not going to go down to Belarus levels. The average person lives to be 50 or anything, but it will fall because children are urinating cesium right now. They are showing symptoms of thyroid problems. There are nosebleeds. There are lung problems. There are migraine headaches. They are happening. Polydactyly is on the rise. I would assume that miscarriages would be on the rise. This is a big problem. What's not clear, again, is simply, does TEPCO number one, the government of Japan number two, and then the whole world number three, even have the capability of sealing this site to any satisfactory condition? Being that it's right on the ocean, being that it's on a major fault line in a very earthquake-prone area, being that there were multiple reactor failures, being that it's possible, it's been speculated that some of these rods during one of the explosions, I believe it was Unit 3, got literally blasted to pieces and then scattered around an area of about 10 square miles. If that's the case, there's no real way to decontaminate that level of radioactivity. It's going to persist in the soil for many decades or centuries. You have this relatively agrarian area with a lot of farms and a lot of ranches that's now functionally useless for any real purpose. On an island of tens of millions of people with an extremely high population density where they need every inch of land they can get. Plus, you've got the problem if they're going to shut down all their nuclear reactors, they don't really have any other fuel resources in Japan, which is something that some people haven't taken into account. But again, radiation levels have spiked in the groundwater around this one site. It's now clear that this radioactivity is basically moving around freely, and simply TEPCO isn't trying to solve the issues at the site. They're simply trying to keep it from getting worse, is what I fear is the case, that they realize they can't fix these issues. So basically, they're just trying to control the area and prevent more meltdowns and even more catastrophes down the road. Peace out.